History of the World, Chapter 24, Emperors in the Age of Chivalry. In these fairy tale times, full of color and adventure, there was a new family of knights ruling in Germany. They took their name, Hohenstaufen, from their castle. One of them was Emperor Frederick I, nicknamed Barbarossa by the Italians on account of his magnificent fiery red beard. Now you may wonder why history should choose to remember him by his Italian name. After all, Frederick I was a German emperor. It is simply because he spent much of his time in Italy, and the deeds that made him famous happened there. It wasn't just the Pope and his power to bestow the imperial crown of Rome on German kings that attracted Barbarossa to Italy. He was also determined to rule the whole of Italy, because he needed money. Couldn't he get money from Germany, I can hear you asking? No, he couldn't, because in those days, in Germany, there was almost none at all. Have you ever wondered why people actually need money? To live on, of course, you say, but that isn't strictly true. Try eating a coin. People live on bread and other foods, and someone who grows grain and makes his own bread doesn't need money any more than Robinson Crusoe did. Nor does anyone who is given his bread for nothing. And that's how it was in Germany. The serfs cultivated their fields and gave a tenth of their harvest to the knights and monks who owned the land. But where did the peasants get their plows from, and their smocks, and their yokes, and the things they needed for their animals? Well, mostly by exchange. If, for example, a peasant had an ox, but would rather have 6 sheep to give him wool to make a jacket, he would exchange them for something with his neighbor. And if he had slaughtered an ox, and spent the long winter evenings turning the 2 horns into fine drinking cups, he could exchange one of the cups for some flax grown by his neighbor, which his wife could weave and make into a coat. This is known as barter. So in Germany, people managed perfectly well in those days without money, since most of them were either peasants or landowners. Nor did the monasteries need money, for they too owned a lot of land, which pious people either gave them or left to them when they died. Apart from vast forests, small fields, and a few villages, castles and monasteries, there was almost nothing else in the whole great German kingdom. That is to say, there were hardly any towns, and it was only in towns that people needed money. Shoemakers, cloth merchants, and scribes can hardly satisfy their hunger and thirst with leather cloth and ink. They need bread. But can you see yourself going to the shoemaker and paying for your shoes with bread for him to live on? And in any case, if you aren't a baker, where will you get the bread? From a baker, yes, but what will you give the baker in return? Perhaps I can lend him a hand, and if he doesn't need your help, or if you have already promised to help the lady who sells fruit, you see it would be unimaginably complicated if people who live in towns were to barter. This is why people agreed to decide on something to exchange which everyone would want and therefore accept, something easy to share out and carry around, which wouldn't go bad or lose its value if you put it away. It was decided that the best thing would be metal, that is, gold or silver. All money was once made of metal, and rich people went around with purses stuffed with gold coins on their belts. That meant you could give the shoemaker money for shoes, and he could use it to buy bread from the baker, who could give it to the peasant in exchange for flour, and the peasant might then use your money to buy a new plow. He wouldn't find that for barter in his neighbor's garden. However, there were very few towns in Germany in the days of chivalry, so people there had little need of money, whereas in Italy money had been in use since Roman times. Italy had always had great cities, and many merchants with bags of money on their belts, and even more stowed away in great chests. Some of these towns were by the sea, like Venice, which is actually in the sea on a cluster of little islands where the inhabitants had to take refuge from the Huns. Then there were other great harbor towns, such as Genoa and Pisa, whose ships sailed far across the seas and came back from the Orient with fine cloth, rare spices, and weapons of great value. These goods were sold off in the ports to be sold again inland in cities like Florence, Verona, or Milan, where the cloth might be made into clothes or perhaps banners or tents. These then went to France, whose capital city, Paris, already contained almost 100,000 inhabitants, or to England, or even to Germany. But not much went to Germany because there was very little money there to pay for such things. People who lived in towns grew richer and richer, and no one could give them orders because they weren't peasants and didn't belong to anyone's fief. On the other hand, since no one had granted them land, they weren't lords either. They governed themselves, much as people did in antiquity. They had their own courts of law, and were as free and independent in their cities as the monks and the knights. Such citizens, called burghers in Germany or the bourgeoisie in France, were known as the Third Estate. Of course, peasants didn't count. This brings us back at last to the Emperor Barbarossa, who needed money. As Holy Roman Emperor, he wanted to be the actual ruler of Italy and to receive tribute and taxes from Italian citizens. But the citizens would have none of it. They were used to their freedom and didn't wish to give it up. So Barbarossa took an army over the Alps to Italy, where he summoned a number of famous jurists in 1158, who solemnly and publicly declared that as Holy Roman Emperor and successor to the Roman Caesars, he had all the rights his predecessors had had a thousand years before. The Italian cities took no notice. They still refused to pay, so the emperor led his army against them, and, in particular, against Milan, the town at the heart of the rebellion. It is said that he was so incensed by their refusal that he swore not to wear his crown until he had forced the town into submission, and he kept his oath. Only when Milan had fallen and was utterly destroyed did he hold a banquet at which he and his wife appeared with their crowns once more on their heads. But no matter how many great and successful campaigns he led, Barbarossa had only to turn his back and head for home for the rumblings of revolt to start up again. The Milanese rebuilt their town and refused to recognize a German ruler. In all, Barbarossa led 6 campaigns against Italy, but his fame was always greater than his success. He was seen to be the very model of a knight. He was extremely strong, mentally as well as physically, and he was generous and knew how to hold a feast. Today we have forgotten what a real feast is like. Everyday life compared to ours may have been mean and monotonous, but a feast in those days was unlike anything you could imagine. It was indescribably lavish and magnificent, like something out of a fairy tale. Barbarossa held one in Mainz, where his sons were dubbed knights in 1181, to which 40,000 knights with all their squires and attendants were invited. They stayed in brightly colored tents, and the emperor and his sons had the grandest one of all, which was made of silk and stood in the center of the encampment. Fires blazed all around, with whole oxen, wild boar, and innumerable chickens roasting over them on spits. People came from far and wide, dressed in all sorts of costumes, jugglers and acrobats and wandering minstrels, who sang all the great songs of old in the evening while they feasted. What a sight it must have been! The emperor himself displayed his skills jousting with his sons, while all the nobles in the land looked on. A feast like this went on for days. Long after it was over, the minstrels continued to sing about it. As a true knight, Barbarossa eventually went on a crusade. This was the Third Crusade in 1189. King Richard the Lionheart of England and the French King Philip also took part. They went by sea, but Barbarossa chose to go by land and was drowned in a river in Asia Minor. His grandson, Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, said it at the beginning, I could say it now. Hohenstaufen was even more remarkable, even greater and altogether more admirable than Barbarossa. He was brought up in Sicily, and while he was still a child and unable to rule himself, there was a lot of trouble in Germany between the great rival families over who was to be the new sovereign. Some favored Philip, Barbarossa's youngest son, while others had elected Otto, whose family was called Welf. This gave people who already couldn't endure each other yet another reason to squabble. If one was for Philip, then his neighbor would side with Otto, and the happy custom of these rival factions, known in Italy as the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, persisted for many years, even after Philip and Otto were long gone. Meanwhile, Frederick had grown up in Sicily, and I mean grown up, both in body and mind. His guardian, Pope Innocent III, was one of the most important men there have ever been. What Gregory VII, the German king, Henry IV's great adversary, had fought so hard for, and had failed to achieve, Innocent III had accomplished. He really was the lord of all Christendom, a man of exceptional intelligence and culture. He ruled them all, not just the spiritual leaders of the Church, but all the princes of Europe. His power had reached so far as England. One day, King John refused to carry out his orders. He excommunicated him and forbade any priest to celebrate Mass in England. The English nobility became so angry with their king that they took away almost all his power. In 1215, he had to solemnly swear that he would never again oppose their will. This was the famous Magna Carta, the great charter to which King John put his seal, in which he granted his barons a whole host of rights which English citizens hold to this day. But England still had to pay taxes and tribute to Pope Innocent III, so great was his power. Frederick II of Hohenstaufen wasn't only highly intelligent. He was an attractive and likable young man as well. In order to claim his crown as King of the Germans, he set out from Sicily virtually on his own on an adventurous ride which took him through Italy and over the Swiss mountains to Constance. However, when he arrived, he found that his rival Otto was marching toward him at the head of an army. There seemed little hope for Frederick, but the burghers of Constance, like all those who met him and came to know him, were so charmed by him that they rallied round and hastily closed the city gates. When Otto arrived exactly 1 hour late, all he could do was turn round and go away. Having similarly won over all the German princes, Frederick suddenly found he had become a mighty ruler, lord of all the vassals of Germany and Italy. So again the two powers were in conflict, just as in the days of Pope Gregory VII and Henry IV. But Frederick was no Henry. He did not go to Canossa, and he didn't intend to beg the Pope for mercy. Like Pope Innocent III, he was convinced that he had been called to rule the world. Frederick knew everything that Innocent had known. After all, Innocent had been his guardian. He knew everything the Germans knew, for they were his family, and finally he knew everything the Arabs knew, for he had grown up in Sicily. He was to spend much of his life there, and in Sicily there was more for him to learn than anywhere else in the world. Sicily had been ruled by everyone: the Phoenicians, Greeks, Carthaginians, Romans, Arabs, Normans, Italians, and Germans. Soon it would be the turn of the French. It must have been just like the Tower of Babel, except that there people had ended up understanding almost nothing, whereas Frederick ended up by understanding nearly everything there was to know. Not just every language, but many whole branches of knowledge. He wrote poetry and was a superb huntsman. He even wrote a book on falconry, for people hunted with hawks in those days. Above all, he knew about religions. But there was one thing he could never understand: why people were always fighting. He liked to have discussions with learned Muslims, even though he was a devout Christian. When the Pope got wind of this, he was angrier than ever, and in particular, a Pope whose name was Gregory. He was just as powerful, but perhaps not as wise, as his predecessor, Pope Innocent III. He wanted Frederick to undertake a crusade at all costs, and threatened to excommunicate him if he didn't. So in the end, he did. But what all other crusades had achieved only through great sacrifice and loss of life, Frederick did without any fighting at all. Christian pilgrims were allowed to visit the Holy Sepulchre without fear of being attacked, and all the land around Jerusalem was held to belong to them. And how did he do that? He just sat down with the Sultan who ruled there, and they came to an agreement. Both sides were happy that things had gone so well, and that war had been averted, but the Bishop of Jerusalem was not content, for no one had consulted him. So he complained to the Pope that the Emperor was too friendly with the Arabs, and the Pope became convinced that Frederick had become a Muslim. But Emperor Frederick II didn't care. He just rejoiced that he had achieved more for Christians than anyone else had ever done, and crowned himself King of Jerusalem, for no priest could be found who was willing to crown him against the Pope's wishes. And we will pause there.